Welcome back to the Brothers Mahoney. I am Michael.
And I am James.
And today we are discussing Phantasmagoria.
Phantasmagoria is the second of the main range of Doctor Who Big Finish, released in October 1999 following the Sirens of Time. This is written by Mark Gatiss, who is a big name in Doctor Who. He does things from acting in episodes to acting in these Big Finish audio dramas to writing episodes and to writing books in the 90s. He really does kind of everything. He's just one of those people who's he's one of those people who just has talents in a lot of fields. This happens to be a story with the fifth Doctor and Turlough, which is a very interesting Doctor companion dynamic as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, from Big Finish, the website, here is the plot of Phantasmagoria. The TARDIS takes the Doctor and Turlough to the London of 1702, where a mysterious highwayman roams the streets. A local occultist has made contact with the dead, and gentlemen of fashion are disappearing, only to find themselves in a chamber whose walls weep blood. The time travelers become immersed in the hideous plan of Sir Nicholas Valentine, a gambler at the mysterious Diablo Club, who always seems to have a winning hand.
Yeah, this feels quite a bit like a classic Who story. Of course, Sands of Time had multiple Doctors, but this one just has the fifth Doctor and Turlough. And it runs about an hour and a half, and it has quite, I think, a classic feel to it.
Yeah, to me it feels not quite as gothic as the Hinchcliffe era, but it certainly feels more around that era than really anything we got with the fifth Doctor. Again, with just the fifth Doctor and Turlough, it feels like a different dynamic than we had with the fifth Doctor for really most of his time, because he always had Tegan and Nyssa, and in the early days, Adric. They were always around. It was kind of like a family during that time. But here it's just two lads together, basically. And in fact, one of the first scenes we get with the Doctor is the very amusing scene of the fifth Doctor trying to teach Turlough about cricket.
Yeah, and I'm sure if you remember some classic Who, in Black Orchid, which is it's one of these short, just a 2-part story, there's a whole segment there with the Doctor happily playing cricket, and looks like he was having a grand old time. When it comes to the fifth Doctor, though, admittedly, he's never been one of my personal favorites as far as classic Who is concerned.
As for me, it's how to describe my feelings towards the fifth Doctor. I don't hate any of his stories for the most part, but he really does just seem like another guy. He just doesn't have the otherworldly personality you've come to expect from the Doctor, especially after 7 years of Baker. But even even besides Baker, Pertwee was very commanding, very authoritative, and just had a real presence, especially with the way he dressed, the capes, the frills, very distinctive. Any room he walked in, you knew he was there. Even the second Doctor, for as different as he was from Pertwee, you also knew he was there. He was sometimes childish. He wasn't dressed the most well. And while he hid behind a joking facade and sometimes acted like an idiot, he always knew a lot, and he always kept a lot in his back pocket. Now, he could be a bit more emotive than maybe you might be used to a Doctor, but it still works fine. But when it comes to the fifth Doctor, again, he feels like another person. He feels like he's almost on par with Turlough. Yeah, I guess you can tell that he's the quote-unquote leader of the two, but even in this story, it didn't always feel like it.
Yeah, when it comes to me, it's not that the fifth Doctor does have personality, because he has personality every now and again. He seems like a really nice guy, but he just seems so almost lukewarm. He's not boasting with personality. He might have some, but Tom Begay, I mean, you can't really compare anyone to Tom Begay, but try to compare him to even Sylvester McCoy or Colin Begay or John Pertwee. It just doesn't match up. Like you said, his stories are generally pretty decent. Earthshock, for instance, is a pretty well-respected story, and it's always a pretty good time. But as a Doctor himself, the fifth Doctor just never interested me as much as Colin Baker or almost any of the Doctors of Classic Who or even New Who.
Besides, of course, Whittaker.
Yeah, the only exception that immediately comes to mind is Jodie Whittaker, and again, that's not necessarily Jodie Whittaker's fault, but the writing during that time was not ideal. Despite the fact the fifth Doctor isn't my personal preference, I always did think Turlough was one of the more interesting companions of the classic era.
Yeah, he was one of the few. I want to say one of the few male companions. I mean, in the early days, they were a lot more common because there was, I mean, from the very beginning, Ian, and I love Ian as a companion. I think Ian is a great companion.
Of course,
Honestly,
my favorite companion is Jamie, classic companion right there.
yeah, Jamie's great. He was there almost the entire time of the second Doctor. I think he missed one story with him.
I believe so, yes.
And even Tom Beggy had Dr. Harry Sullivan, who was only there for one season, but I found him a very affable guy. He was just a fun character to have around. But after Harry Sullivan left, there was a period of time where it really was just a Doctor with, one woman companion, be it Sarah Jane. Well, yeah, the rest of his time with Sarah Jane, Leela, and Leela was pretty good. Romana 2, if you were to count those as two separate ones, it doesn't really count. Then they finally pick Adric up, and that adds a very interesting component, with a younger, not, kid, but, he's, what do you think he's supposed to be, 14?
Yeah, I'd say around there. That sounds about right.
Yeah, so a younger companion anyway. And then it becomes a family, which I know that Tambego, that's one of the reasons he decided to leave. It becomes kind of a family because they very quickly pick up Nisa and then Tegan back to back after Romana leaves. And then there's 4 people traveling the TARDIS at one time. And it sometimes seems busy, but at the same time, because of what we were saying before about the Fifth Doctor's more tepid personality, we kind of needed those other people there because it does.
Yeah, actually, that makes a lot of sense. Because if he did have a more bombastic personality like Tom Beggy, none of the other companions would get any screen time.
No, it would work with Tom Bago as the main Doctor. It had to be somebody who was kind of just another guy who had a small bit of more authority. That's the only way that dynamic was going to work with that many companions.
Yeah, and Turlough himself has a sort of an interesting background as a companion.
He does. I'm not going to lie. I don't remember too much about it. I've only seen Maldron and Dad once. I really do like Enlightenment. I found that quite a fun story. And I know the basics that he was, I don't remember if he was hired, but he was set by the Black Guardian to kill the 5th Doctor. But I don't remember the very first story he was in. So I'm not the one to ask about the interesting background.
Even so, the pain of the 5th Doctor and Turlough, it's a decent pain. I think they worked well for the story. Though I have to say, maybe if the story wasn't quite as decent as it was, maybe the two of them together wouldn't have worked out quite as well.
Well, one thing to take note about this story, and we're not going to go into spoilers for the story. Again, these are pretty cheap. You can just pick it up yourself. It's only an hour and a half. But the thing is that for most of the story, it's kind of like a classic Who story. The Doctor and Turlough are separated. They're together a bit at the beginning. Then something happens at the end of episode 1. And then they don't meet up again until I believe it's the very end of episode 3 or maybe the beginning of episode 4.
Yeah, so it has a very classic Who feel to it. I also rather enjoy a lot of the music. Now, naturally, it being an audio production, you'd hope the music would be good. And it is. And even like the antagonist, it's an individual named Nicholas Valentine as the plot gems Rad said. He sort of has this sort of creepy theme used whenever he's talking. And he has a really good voice actor too, being a David Ryall.
Yeah, it's a very good motif that pops up, especially in his opening scene when you first see him in the Diablo Club. He's just sitting alone at the table. One, this is a type of club it's hard for me to imagine. There are just people at different tables playing their own games of, card games. It's not like a casino or anything. There's no house. It's just people come in, they play games with each other. I can't say I've been in a place like that before. But no, he's just sitting at his own on the table, and a server, a waiter, comes up and, he wants to know what game he's playing. And this response he plays the long game.
After some sinister laughing too. It's good.
Yeah, and then some sinister laughing thrown in for Gold Master. And that's not very informative, but I guess it works, and it's a nice introduction to him. One interesting thing about David Ryall, the voice actor for Nicholas Valentine, son Nicholas Valentine, I sort of respect his taste in, is that he was in one of the Harry Potter movies. I happen to be a fan of the Harry Potter series in general, not so much the author, but I grew up with the series. It has a place in my heart. And he played a character in the Deathly Hallows Part 1 who was there for about the scene. It was an okay scene. I had no idea who the voice actor was until, I looked at the credits. I like looking at the credits of these big fitness things, see if I recognize anybody. And that's when I first made the connection. So that's just a nice, fun thing I noticed.
And speaking of some voice performances, even though David Ryall is probably the standout, I think there's a lot of really good performances. And I'm not even talking about Peter Davison or Mark Strickson, of course, who voices Turlough. There's a Stephen Wickham who voices a Dr. Samuel Hollywell. And he sort of has a nice classic old-timey type vibe to him.
I mean, it was the 1700s, so.
Yeah, he sounds like a very genial guy. There's a Julia Dalkin who voices a maid called Hannah. And actually, Hannah has a pretty interesting character.
Yes, I would say so.
Yeah.
She has a great voice, too.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good performance. And we mentioned that this story was written by Mark Gatiss, who, like James said, is a big name in Doctor Who. He also voices one of the characters here, being a Jasper Jeek.
Which is a great name.
Indeed. And I didn't catch it when I was listening to it the first time, but once I realized it was Mark Gatiss and I was listening to his voice, I'm like, you know what? Hey, I know that guy. Mark Gatiss is obviously a big name, and he's done some acting. I recognize him from Sherlock, for instance, where he played Mycroft. He was, of course, in Thrice Upon a Time, which was the final Peter Capaldi's toy. And he was also in Game of Thrones for an episode or two.
Maybe even 3.
So, yeah, Mark Gatiss is even disregarding his writing and other things he's done for Doctor Who behind the scenes. He's an actor who I'm somewhat familiar with, and I definitely liked hearing his voice here.
Yeah, it is nice. And of course, he becomes a pretty big writer for the Revival series. So it's always nice to see these people kind of get into place before the series gets revived, at this point, 6 years later.
And what I think helps with that, with the performances, is that this story, because it takes place in the early 1700s, a lot of the vernacular used, a lot of the dialogue is sort of based around that time period. There's plenty of lines. I mean, you can understand it. I mean, I watch a bunch of older movies, so I don't have any problem following along. But they just sort of use a somewhat archaic language. Like one line that comes to mind: "Do you play the knave with me, so?"
Yeah, that was, I believe that was actually spoken to the Doctor. We were being the most kind to Davison earlier, but the Doctor was pretty fun in this story. It was the type of story that works well with Peter Davison. I will say that. Davison did very well in this story.
Yeah, I think the story as a whole, like we mentioned, has just a pretty good atmosphere.
Yeah, another line that came to mind was at the very beginning. Well, like we were saying earlier, there were these people, a bunch of gentlemen playing cards at this club. And this one gentleman, he was bored. So he just gets up from the table and he leaves. And he says that he has no stomach for further pleasures.
And yeah, even another line, and this one had Mark Gatiss in the scene also. But Mark Gatiss and another individual are just in a carriage and they get robbed by a highwayman. And after the highwayman absconds with their money, they're like, we can dine off this toy for years.
Yeah, Mark Gatiss was, you could tell he was having fun with this story. You really could, which works well because he is the writer, so he gets you have more fun than most, I suppose.
But yeah, I just appreciate the atmosphere of the story. Part 4, which went into what's actually going on, the mysterious disappearances of these gentlemen, I think it was pretty well done. Yeah, some nice science fiction stuff going on, which for a lot of the story, it's not really at the forefront. But it just pops up more at the end, again, feeling like some classic Who stories.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that even though the story was very classic feeling, they would have gotten away with it even in the Hinchcliffe era, because there was a certain couple of scenes near the end that were, as the plot says, the gentlemen found themselves in a chamber whose walls weep blood. That's not getting past the censors. What was her name?
Mary Whitehouse.
Mary Whitehouse would not have liked that. So, yeah. Even the Hinchcliffe era at its most absurd, like a what was it, a shotgun and a mist of blood from.
The shotgun blast in the brains of Mobius. I thought that scene was fantastic. I
Yeah,
enjoyed that.
yeah, honestly, that's the only scene I remember. But I mean, that's the thing. You remember that. You don't expect to see that in a Doctor Who story. But yeah, so there were some things in this episode that really would have pushed the limits if it had been on, had been on TV where, it was supposed to quote unquote fit in. And the interesting thing is because this is just the Doctor and Turlough, this fits in only one specific place, and that's right after Tegan left in Resurrection of the Daleks. And she had a great leaving scene, and we'll discuss it eventually. But yeah, so the story after Resurrection of the Daleks happened to be Planet of Fire, which is where Turlough happens to leave, and where they pick up Perry. So this happens to just take place between Resurrection of the Daleks, which I believe is story 134, and Planet of Fire, which is 135. And I think that's, again, just an interesting place to decide to do an audio story. It's also interesting that they must have liked the idea so much. This wasn't the only time there was just the Fifth Doctor and Turlough. While we don't have all the audio things, of course, we Big Finish have like 2,000. Or at least it seems that way. There is at least one other audio story where it's just the Fifth Doctor and Turlough. A story in the main range, story number 20, Lou Garreau, which sounds fascinating because it has to do with a werewolf, which is always good fun. I'm sure Davison will love that werewolf.
Yeah, Lou Garreau is a story I'm looking forward to. I mean, there's a lot of Big Finish audio things I'm looking forward to. There's so many ones that have interesting plots, and that just is one of the many. Since we finished this one, it's only the second Big Finish audio drama we've listened to. First one, of course, again being Silence of Time. The Silence of Time did have 3 doctors with, of course, Peter Davison, Sylvester McCoy, and Colin Baker, and it was nice to hear all of them. But this one just felt to me more like a classic Doctor Who story.
Well, that's partly because I would say that even though the Silence of Time was a multi-Doctor story, it wasn't set up like multi-Doctor stories we'd seen in the past. It had a very different setup.
Yeah, I think its setup worked. But when it comes to like enjoyment listening to it, I think I would probably lean. I mean, I think both were decent, but I'd probably lean this direction.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I've only listened to both of them once all the way through. It's almost a flip of the coin which one I enjoy more. I think because of some of the lines in this one, some of the performances, again, by Mark Gatiss and some of the other voice actors, I think I'd probably move towards this one being better. But it really is pretty close for me.
And either way, the fact that both the first and second Big Finish productions are decent, I think it's a good sign for what's moving forward.
Yeah, we have a whole lot in the future, but it's been a pretty good start so far, which is especially good since neither Michael nor I are very well versed in pure audio stories.
And speaking of the future, James, what were we planning to do next?
Yeah, next on our docket, we are going to do The Three Doctors, which was a favorite from both of us, and really the first classic Who story Margaret and I saw growing up, because our father used to own it on VHS. I have no idea what happened to that VHS, but we've remembered the story ever since then. So that is what we decided to pick next.
And so if you want a nice dust of nostalgic value, hashtag be there, as the kids say. This has been the Brothers Mahoney. I am Michael.
And I am James.
And we hope that you've derived some pleasure from this, and that you have a pleasant day.